May 13, 1945, dawn. The acrid smell of diesel exhaust mixed with alpine pine as a black Mercedes idled outside a farmhouse near Salzburg, Austria. Inside, 3 men in civilian clothes burned Wehrmacht uniforms in a stone fireplace, the wool releasing bitter smoke that stung their eyes as ash floated toward wooden rafters. The youngest man pressed a Vatican passport into his coat pocket, the embossed seal, still warm from the forger's iron, and checked his new name one final time before the flames consumed his old identity card. This moment, repeated in hundreds of locations across collapsing Nazi territory, marked the beginning of the most audacious disappearing act in modern history. The ratlines, clandestine escape routes threading through Austria, Italy, Switzerland, and Spain, would channel hundreds, perhaps thousands of fleeing Nazis into South America between 1945 and 1955. But this wasn't chaos, this was architecture. Networks established during wartime, designed for exactly this contingency, now activated with the methodical precision that had characterized the Reich's operations at their height. The same minds that had planned military logistics now planned their own salvation. The texture of these early days reveals the system's sophistication. In cramped monastery rooms along the Italian border, gaslight flickered across tables covered with official stamps, blank passports, and bottles of India ink. Electricity remained unreliable in war-torn Europe, so forgers worked by oil lamp, their fingers stained black as they reproduced seals from municipal offices that no longer existed. The metallic clink of smuggled shortwave radios punctuated late-night meetings, carrying coded messages about border crossings and ship departures. A child's wooden toy, hollowed out to conceal gold coins, sat among the tools of erasure, insurance for the bribe that would open the next door. The escape wasn't random flight, it was coordinated exodus. Otto Skorzeny understood this better than most. The Waffen-SS commando who had orchestrated Mussolini's dramatic rescue from Gran Sasso now orchestrated something far more complex, his own network called Die Spinne, the Spider. After escaping Allied internment, Skorzeny settled into Franco's Spain, which operated as a semi-official hub for fugitives. Madrid's streets smelled of orange blossoms and strong coffee, a civilized veneer over the machinery of disappearance operating in embassy back rooms. Spanish officials issued Nansen passports, documents designed for stateless refugees that allowed SS men to slip toward Latin America. The irony was not lost on survivors. Papers meant to help the persecuted now helped the persecutors. The web extended further than anyone initially grasped. Before you hear how deep this conspiracy reached, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if you're finding this history as shocking as we did researching it, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story gets darker before it gets better. By 1946, multiple overlapping networks had established themselves. The myth of a single monolithic organization called Odessa, popularized later by Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal and novelist Frederick Forsyth, simplified a more complex reality. There was no single mastermind, no central command. Instead, dozens of aid societies, veterans groups, and intelligence networks operated independently, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, but all serving the same function, keeping former Nazis alive, mobile, and connected. Consider the mechanics of a single escape route. A fugitive SS officer begins in Bavaria, where sympathetic former comrades provide the first safe house, a barn's hayloft that reeks of manure and wet straw, protection purchased with looted gold coins from a child's music box. He receives forged papers, a Wehrmacht discharge certificate, a ration card, identity documents claiming he'd been a simple factory worker. The papers feel authentic because they are authentic, blank forms stolen from abandoned municipal offices, now filled with false information but bearing genuine embossed seals. Officials at checkpoints, many themselves former party members, quietly return to their posts, barely glance at the documents. Next stop, Austria, where church intermediaries, their motivations complex, mixing genuine charity with anti-communist politics, provide letters of introduction to Italian contacts. The journey crosses alpine passes at night, pine forests black against starlight, boots crunching on frost, breath condensing in the thin air. An Italian monastery offers temporary shelter, its stone walls holding the cold like a tomb, candlelight reflecting off ancient frescoes, while 20th century criminals plot their futures in hushed German, from Italy to Spain, then across the Atlantic. But here's what makes this conspiracy truly chilling. Some escapees didn't need to escape at all. While thousands fled, thousands more simply stayed and thrived. In port cities like Hamburg and Bremen, the smell of coal, fish, and engine oil mixed with languages from displaced persons' camps, Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, creating a chaotic backdrop where former SS administrators found work as foremen, factory managers, transport coordinators. Survivors would later recall the nauseating shock of seeing the same faces that had run concentration camps now running municipal departments, sitting behind desks in rebuilt government offices, their pasts buried under bureaucratic continuity. The question wasn't just who escaped, it was who allowed them to. Allied denazification proved tragically uneven. By the early 1950s, hundreds of mid-level civil servants and police had returned to their posts in West Germany. The practical need for experienced administrators, people who knew how systems worked, outweighed the moral imperative for justice. This administrative continuity created a protective membrane over former networks, a tacit agreement not to look too closely at anyone's wartime resume. In small towns, villagers whispered about American jeeps during the day and black-coated figures at dawn, rumors of clandestine meetings between supposed enemies. The networks weren't just surviving, they were being recruited. The Cold War's opening moves would transform yesterday's war criminals into today's intelligence assets, and the moral calculations being made in secret would shock even those making them. But that machinery of compromise, Operation Paperclip, the Gehlen Organization, the devil's bargains struck in the name of anti-communism requires understanding what happened next when the spider's web caught the attention of those who should have been cutting it down but instead decided to use it for themselves. Huntsville, Alabama, summer 1946. The humid air pressed down like a wet blanket as Werner von Braun stepped off a military transport, squinting against sunlight reflecting off the Alabama clay. Around him, German accents mingled with southern drawls as 67 rocket scientists, many still wearing Wehrmacht haircuts, were processed into their new American lives. The smell of magnolia blossoms and industrial lubricant hung in the air. No one mentioned that just 18 months earlier, these same men had overseen factories where concentration camp prisoners died by the thousands building V-2 rockets. What happened next would prove that the Fourth Reich didn't need to conquer territory, it just needed to be useful. Operation Paperclip represented the most systematic Allied compromise with Nazi ideology. Between 1945 and 1959, approximately 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to the United States, their pasts sanitized, their war crimes scrubbed from official files. The operation's internal name, initially Overcast, then Paperclip, after the literal paperclips used to attach new security clearances to files, revealed the bureaucratic banality of moral collapse. These weren't just technical experts. Many were Nazi Party members. Some had directly supervised slave labor. All were now essential to America's technological future. The rationale was simple. If we don't take them, the Soviets will. At Fort Bliss, Texas, and later at the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, German engineers worked in facilities that smelled of hot metal, rocket fuel, and the peculiar ozone tang of electrical equipment. They spoke German in the cafeterias, celebrated Christmas with traditional German customs, and quietly maintained networks with colleagues who had fled elsewhere. Von Braun himself wrote letters to former associates in Argentina and Spain, maintaining connections that intelligence agencies monitored but didn't sever. The spider's web had new anchors, one sewn into the fabric of American military-industrial complex. But the scientists were just the visible face of a deeper compromise. 200 miles south of Berlin, in the Munich suburb of Pullach, an even more troubling alliance was taking shape. The compound looked unremarkable. Clipped hedges, anonymous barracks, wire fences surrounding buildings that could have been a suburban firm rather than a spy headquarters. Inside, former Wehrmacht Major General Reinhard Gehlen was building the intelligence apparatus that would become West Germany's BND, the Federal Intelligence Service. His staff roster read like a Nazi war crimes dossier. Former Wehrmacht intelligence officers, ex-SS officers, men who had run interrogation centers on the Eastern Front, where interrogation meant something far darker than questioning. Gehlen had made a simple calculation in 1946. He approached U.S. occupation authorities with an offer: his extensive intelligence files on Soviet military capabilities, built during years of Wehrmacht operations in Russia, in exchange for American protection and funding. The Americans accepted. The Gehlen Organization, as it became known, operated from 1946 to 1956 with CIA support, staffed almost entirely by men who had served the Third Reich. A single memo from Gehlen's files, later paraphrased in his memoirs, captured the era's moral calculus: anti-communism will excuse many pasts. And it did. British and American intelligence agencies recruited former Nazis across Europe. Men who had hunted resistance fighters now hunted communists. Interrogation techniques developed in SS basements were repurposed for Cold War operations. The networks that had coordinated genocide were simply redirected toward a new enemy. In West German villages, residents saw the same black sedans, the same furtive meetings in municipal buildings after dark, the same men who had once worn SS insignia now wearing nondescript suits and carrying American-issued identification. Justice became negotiable. Consider the moral maze facing an Allied intelligence officer in 1947. You sit across a table from a former SS officer who ran agents behind Soviet lines. He offers detailed information about Red Army deployments, weapons development, political purges, intelligence that could save Allied lives if the Cold War turns hot. He also participated in war crimes that killed thousands. The files document his actions. Survivors could testify, but if you arrest him, his intelligence dies with his career. If you recruit him, you become complicit in his crimes. What would you do? The men making these decisions chose utility over justice, and in that choice, they gave the spider's web institutional protection. The compromise extended beyond intelligence into industry and civil society. At Nuremberg and subsequent tribunals, industrialists who had built the Nazi war machine faced justice. Alfred Krupp, whose factories had consumed slave labor like fuel, stood trial in 1947 to 1948. He was convicted, imprisoned, then released by 1951. His industrial assets, seized during occupation, were reconstituted. By the mid-1950s, factories that had produced panzer tanks and artillery now produced consumer appliances and industrial machinery. The buildings smelled the same: hot iron, coal smoke, grease. But now they served reconstruction rather than conquest. The same managers, the same foremen, sometimes even the same workers, simply pivoted from war production to peace production. The machinery survived, so did its operators. In small cities across West Germany, denazification tribunals held hearings in municipal buildings that reeked of furniture polish and old paper. Wooden benches creaked as witnesses testified. Judges shuffled documents, their tired coughs echoing off high ceilings as they read verdicts in clipped German. But the proceedings were theater. By 1948, the appetite for justice had evaporated, replaced by pragmatic need. Too many people had collaborated. Too many skilled administrators had Nazi pasts. The choice became prosecute thousands and paralyze reconstruction, or compromise and rebuild quickly. They chose reconstruction. Meanwhile, in West Germany's new capital of Bonn, a different kind of network was organizing openly. In 1951, former Waffen-SS veterans founded HIAG, Hilfsgemeinschaft auf Gegenseitigkeit der Angehörigen der ehemaligen Waffen-SS, a mutual aid society that claimed 20,000 members by the 1960s. Their offices on Bonn's quiet streets smelled of cigarette smoke, pipe tobacco, and the metallic clack-clack-clack of typewriters producing revisionist histories. They published magazines like Der Freiwillige, The Volunteer, glossy pamphlets that portrayed Waffen-SS service as honorable military duty rather than participation in genocide. Their publishing house, Munin Verlag, produced over 50 years of periodicals and roughly 57 books, creating a persistent stream of propaganda dressed as historical scholarship. The Reich hadn't died, it had learned to publish, but some former Nazis weren't content with publishing and mutual aid societies. Some wanted power again, and they nearly got it through an infiltration plot so brazen that when British authorities uncovered it, the scandal rocked West German politics to its foundations. That conspiracy, and the desperate attempts to revive Nazi political influence in the heart of Europe's new democracy, would reveal just how close the Fourth Reich came to being more than myth. January 15, 1953, 3 a.m., British military police kicked down the door of a Düsseldorf apartment, their boots echoing through the pre-dawn silence. Inside, Werner Naumann, former state secretary in Josef Goebbels' propaganda ministry, sat at a desk, covered with typed lists, party membership rosters, and documents outlining a systematic plan to infiltrate West Germany's Free Democratic Party. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke and fresh ink. On the wall behind him hung a map of West Germany marked with colored pins, indicating sympathetic politicians, potential recruits, and targeted electoral districts. The Fourth Reich had nearly captured democracy from within. The Naumann Circle represented the most sophisticated attempt to restore Nazi political power in post-war Europe. Unlike the crude violence of street movements, this conspiracy operated with bureaucratic precision, the same methods that had brought Hitler to power legally in 1933. Between 1951 and 1953, Naumann and 6 co-conspirators had quietly positioned former Nazi officials within the FDP, particularly its North Rhine-Westphalia branch. Their strategy was elegant: avoid creating a new Nazi party that would be banned, and instead colonize an existing democratic party from within, slowly shifting its platform until former Nazis held positions of influence. They came terrifyingly close to succeeding. The conspiracy's mechanics revealed just how many former officials had retained their skills and connections. Naumann himself had spent the immediate post-war years working as a business consultant, innocent cover for a man rebuilding networks. He met contacts in quiet restaurants that smelled of schnitzel and beer, conversations conducted in low voices beneath the clatter of cutlery. He traveled frequently to Munich, Hamburg, and Bonn, always staying in hotels near train stations for quick exits, always carrying documents in locked briefcases. His network included former Gauleiter, regional Nazi party leaders, propaganda specialists, and wealthy industrialists who provided funding. The British had been watching for months. Intercepts of letters, surveillance photographs, informant reports, all documented the conspiracy's scope. When they finally moved in January 1953, the raids uncovered filing cabinets full of evidence, classified documents outlining infiltration tactics, lists of FDP members who were secretly sympathetic to Nazi ideology, financial records showing money flowing from hidden accounts to political campaigns. The scandal exploded across German newspapers. West German authorities, embarrassed by British intervention on their soil, were forced to confront how close they'd come to allowing Nazi political resurrection. But here's the darker truth: Naumann's arrest didn't end the strategy. It just drove it deeper underground. While attention focused on West Germany's political drama, thousands of former Nazis had already established their ultimate safe haven across the Atlantic in Argentina. Buenos Aires in the early 1950s was a city of contradictions. Elegant European architecture lined avenues that smelled of roasting meat from parrilla, grills, diesel exhaust from buses, and the peculiar mustiness of subtropical humidity on old stone. The streets buzzed with Spanish, Italian, German, and Yiddish, a polyglot chaos where anonymity was easy and questions were rarely asked. President Juan Domingo Perón had made Argentina a sanctuary. Between 1946 and 1955, his government provided visas, safe houses, and bureaucratic inertia that allowed known war criminals to live openly under thin aliases. The mechanisms were straightforward. Argentine consulates in Europe issued immigration papers, sometimes with Vatican endorsements, sometimes with forged employment contracts. Landing cards asked few questions. Police conducted no background checks. Within weeks of arrival, former SS officers walked Buenos Aires streets as free men. Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust's logistics, arrived in 1950 and lived in Buenos Aires suburbs under the name Ricardo Clement. He worked in a Mercedes-Benz factory, the smell of motor oil and welding fumes replacing the bureaucratic staleness of his former Reich security main office. He married, fathered children, attended German social clubs where veterans gathered to reminisce over beer and wurst. Nobody questioned his past too closely. The unspoken rule in these communities: don't ask, and certainly don't tell. Josef Mengele followed a similar path. The Auschwitz doctor who had conducted horrific medical experiments moved through a chain of safe houses, Germany to Italy to Spain to Argentina, between 1949 and 1959. The texture of these spaces revealed the network's durability: cramped rooms where mate tea steeped in metal gourds, wood smoke from inefficient stoves, wet wool overcoats hung to dry after long journeys from European ports. Survivors would later identify safe houses partly by these sensory markers. The smell of fear had its own signature. Small South American towns with German colonies provided perfect cover. Bariloche in Argentina, nestled in Patagonian mountains, could have been transported from Bavaria. German schools taught children in their ancestral language. German-language churches conducted services. Breweries produced beer using traditional methods, the yeasty aroma filling streets on Sunday mornings. In these communities, a German accent raised no suspicion. A reluctance to discuss the past was simply European discretion. Former concentration camp commandants became respected businessmen, their pasts buried under layers of communal silence. What would you do if your neighbor was a war criminal, if the friendly shopkeeper who sold your children candy had once supervised atrocities? This wasn't hypothetical for many German immigrants who arrived legitimately. They found themselves living alongside monsters wearing human masks. The business networks proved especially durable. Former Nazi engineers and managers were attractive to Latin American countries, desperate to industrialize. They found consultancy roles in Argentina's growing aviation industry, construction projects in Chile, agricultural development in Paraguay. Their technical expertise, divorced from moral judgment, made them valuable. A man who had organized factory production using slave labor could just as easily organize it using paid workers. The skills transferred seamlessly, only the victims changed. Financial lifelines sustained the networks, hidden caches of Nazi-looted assets, gold coins in hollowed-out children's toys, art stashed in monastery cellars, bank accounts in Swiss institutions, financed escapes and resettlement. The amounts were never as vast as conspiracy theories claimed, but they didn't need to be. A few gold coins bought passage on a ship, a piece of looted art sold to a corrupt dealer funded 6 months of living expenses. The mechanics were small-scale but effective. Death camp plunder converted into comfortable exile. Religious institutions remained controversial enablers. Some Catholic clergy, motivated by anti-communist ideology and a distorted sense of Christian mercy, provided or endorsed travel documents. Vatican passports, intended for genuine refugees, were sometimes issued to men fleeing justice. These acts would spark investigations and demands for declassification decades later. But in the early 1950s, the moral compromises happened in rectory offices where incense smoke masked the stench of complicity. Yet, even in this apparent success, the networks contained the seeds of their own destruction. They were too connected, too organized, too confident. They maintained correspondence, held reunions, published memoirs. Every connection created vulnerability. Every letter could be intercepted. Every photograph at a veterans gathering documented who still maintained ties. Someone was watching. Someone was compiling evidence. And in 1960, the hunter would finally catch his prey in a moment that would prove the Fourth Reich, for all its careful planning, could never truly hide from justice. The question wasn't whether they would be found, but what would be done when they were. May 11th, 1960, dusk. A Buenos Aires suburb called San Fernando. A man in shabby work clothes stepped off the bus at his usual stop, briefcase in hand, the day's factory grime still on his shirt. He smelled of machine oil and sweat, just another working-class German immigrant heading home. 3 men in a black sedan watched from across the street. One checked a photograph against the figure shuffling down the sidewalk. The nose matched. The ears matched. The way he walked, slightly hunched, perpetually cautious, matched surveillance reports compiled over months of patient observation. Ricardo Clement was about to stop existing because Adolf Eichmann had been found. The Israeli Mossad agents who grabbed Eichmann off that Buenos Aires street executed the most dramatic Nazi capture in history. They drugged him, disguised him as an El Al flight crew member, and smuggled him out of Argentina on a plane. The operation violated Argentine sovereignty, sparked a diplomatic crisis, and proved something that terrified every fugitive Nazi. The networks weren't as invisible as they believed. Every letter intercepted, every photograph analyzed, every informant cultivated. It all led to this moment when the architect of industrial genocide was dragged from comfortable anonymity into the harsh light of judgment. The capture revealed both the success and porousness of the ratlines. Eichmann had lived openly for a decade using a name so thin it barely qualified as an alias. He worked, socialized, raised a family. Argentine authorities either didn't know or didn't care, but his capture also demonstrated that someone always knew. Files later declassified showed CIA and British intelligence had lists of fugitives' locations as early as the late 1940s. They knew. They simply lacked political will or legal means, or perhaps desire to act. How many others could have been caught but weren't? The Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, beginning April 11th, 1961, forced the world to confront what many had been content to forget. For months, cameras broadcast testimony from survivors, each story a hammer blow against the comfortable myth that the Nazi past could simply be buried. The trial sparked renewed investigations, archival hunts, diplomatic pressure. Other fugitives went deeper underground. Some fled Argentina for Paraguay or Brazil. Others, growing old and sick, simply waited to die before justice found them. Josef Mengele spent his final decades moving between increasingly squalid safe houses, the texture of his exile degrading with each move. The urbane doctor who had once strutted through Auschwitz in polished boots now hid in remote farmhouses that smelled of animal dung and mildew. He suffered strokes, paranoia, bitterness. When he drowned while swimming off a Brazilian beach in 1979, his death went unnoticed for years. No dramatic capture, no trial. Just a pathetic end for a pathetic man who had escaped earthly justice but not mortality. But most former Nazis never faced even that indignity. They simply continued. Back in West Germany, HIAG continued operating until 1992, 47 years of revisionist publishing, veterans rallies, and lobbying. Their offices in Bonn kept producing magazines where former Waffen-SS men portrayed themselves as soldiers, rather than participants in genocide. The metallic screech of printing presses never stopped, churning out pamphlets destined for postboxes in sleepy villages where younger generations were recruited into fringe nationalist groups. The smell of printers' ink and cigarette smoke became the olfactory signature of memory wars fought with words rather than weapons. The Americans who had brought Nazi scientists through Operation Paperclip watched. Those same men built the Saturn V rocket that carried humans to the moon. Werner von Braun became a celebrity, his face on magazine covers, his German accent charming Americans who knew nothing of Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, where prisoners died building his earlier rockets. The moral compromise was complete, technological triumph, built on unpunished atrocity. When von Braun died in 1977, obituaries celebrated his genius while footnoting his past. The Gehlen Organization transitioned into West Germany's official BND intelligence service in 1956. Former Wehrmacht and SS officers simply changed letterhead, their pasts absorbed into the bureaucratic continuity of the Cold War. Files recently declassified show the extent of the compromise: known war criminals recruiting new agents, former concentration camp administrators drawing government salaries, the spider's web woven directly into NATO's intelligence architecture. The question wasn't whether Western democracies had collaborated with Nazis, it was whether they could have won the Cold War without doing so. Some would say yes, others would say history isn't written by those with clean hands. In Argentina, the German community maintained its dual identity into the 21st century. Children and grandchildren of immigrants, some legitimate refugees, others war criminals, grew up speaking German, celebrating Oktoberfest, running businesses their ancestors had established. Many never knew their heritage's dark truth. Others knew and kept silent. Bariloche still has German schools and Bavarian-style architecture. The breweries still produce beer using traditional methods. The past isn't gone, it's present, blended into the everyday texture of life, invisible to those who don't know where to look. The Fourth Reich conspiracy ultimately failed not because justice prevailed, but because it was never as necessary as its architects imagined. They had feared prosecution, execution, social destruction. Instead, they found accommodation, utility, opportunity. The Reich didn't need to be rebuilt in secret because substantial pieces of it were simply absorbed into the post-war order. Former Nazis became scientists, spies, businessmen, politicians. They published, organized, prospered. Some faced justice, most didn't. What does that tell us about the nature of evil? That it requires grand conspiracies and secret organizations, or that it simply requires ordinary people willing to look away when looking closely would be inconvenient? By the late 20th century, age accomplished what justice could not. The generation that built the Third Reich died in comfortable beds, surrounded by families, their crimes unpunished or minimally acknowledged. Otto Skorzeny, the commando who had styled himself a post-war fixer, died in Spain in 1975. Werner Naumann, whose political conspiracy had nearly succeeded, died peacefully in 1982. Thousands of others followed, taking their secrets to graves marked with respectable names in respectable cemeteries. The files remain, the documentation exists, historians continue uncovering connections, compromises, crimes, but the living witnesses, both victims and perpetrators, are nearly gone. Within a generation, the Fourth Reich conspiracy will transform from living memory into pure history, its lessons debated by people who never smelled the fear in a safe house or felt the moral calculus of choosing utility over justice. The spider's web was real, the ratlines functioned, the network survived. Former Nazis did plan comebacks through business, propaganda, and political infiltration. Some succeeded, most adapted. A few faced consequences. But the conspiracy's deepest success wasn't in its grand plans. It was in the thousands of small accommodations, the bureaucratic compromises, the willingness of victors to become accomplices when it served their interests. The Fourth Reich didn't need to conquer, it just needed to be useful enough to survive, and in that survival, in those compromises, lies a lesson more disturbing than any conspiracy: that evil doesn't require grand plots when ordinary pragmatism will do, that justice delayed is often justice denied, that the price of fighting one totalitarian system was partnership with survivors of another. The conspiracy failed to rebuild the Reich, but it succeeded in proving how easily the unthinkable becomes acceptable when the alternative seems inconvenient. That legacy, that knowledge of how quickly principles bend under pressure, might be the Fourth Reich's most enduring victory, not the one they planned, but the one we allowed.